we shall turn our focus to Coleridge, the most learned of the Romantic poet theorists, who was responsible for adapting German philosophy to British Romantic theory. Through a close look at his Biographia Literaria, we shall explore his vital distinction between the natural philosopher, who moves from object to subject, and the transcendental philosopher, who reverses this motion. We shall study the need for these two philosophical journeys to meet in a fusion of object and subject, nature and mind. Of all the British Romantic theorists, Coleridge was the most learned. He possessed a nearly photographic memory, a keen, discerning intellect, and a knowledge of Greek, Latin, Hebrew, German, French, and Italian. He had, I would say, one of the most disciplined, well, maybe not disciplined, but intelligent minds of the 19th century. A brilliant man, incredibly gifted. Now, Coleridge was the man most responsible for importing and interpreting for his countrymen the intricacies of German philosophy and theory. British tend to be more pragmatic. They have a hard time dealing with the abstractness of of German theory. And Coleridge was the only one that could explain it to them in words they could understand. It's sort of like one of my British friends tells me that Alistair Cooke was the only man who could explain the American electoral college system to the British. They could not understand it. It is pretty crazy anyway. But I don't know if that's true, but that's what I was told by my British friend. Well, he explained the Germans the way nobody else could. I should mention, interestingly, that in the second half of the 19th century, the famous Thomas Carlyle picked up where Coleridge left off and continued to interpret the Germans for his countrymen. Now, if Coleridge played this role for Britain in general, he played it for Wordsworth in particular. In other words, everything that Wordsworth knew about German theory, he learned it from Coleridge, not from college or anywhere else. All of his philosophical insights in many ways come from Coleridge. Now, it is in his autobiography, the Biographia Literaria, that Coleridge deals most directly with German theory and expounds most fully his theoretical views on poetry. Indeed, his readings of such German philosophers as Kant, Schelling, and Fichte are so close that he has been, justifiably, often accused of plagiarism. And if you've ever read anything about Coleridge, this always pops and rears its ugly head. And by the way, that's not a new thing people were accusing of back in the 19th century. And it is true. There are some very many too close paraphrases in his work where he's pretty close to the Germans. But what I would say is that despite the very close paraphrases he uses, his work still, I believe, offers a unified, compelling, original synthesis of literary theory that renders concrete and accessible a host of German abstractions. As with Sidney, the uniqueness is in the synthesis. A lot of the ideas are borrowed, perhaps, from the Germans, but he takes those ideas and makes them work, makes them concrete, embodies them. So I would still say it's a very original work. And there's only a few chapters where the plagiarism occurs. All right. At the heart of his philosophical and theoretical views for Coleridge lies a vital distinction between two opposing but complementary types of thinkers, what Coleridge calls the natural philosopher and the transcendental philosopher. And these two philosophers, the way Coleridge describes them, go on journeys. Remember Hegel's interested in the journey of the philosopher? Well, for Coleridge, the journey of the philosopher is actually similar to the journey of the poet. They're brought together, and both natural and transcendental philosopher go on journeys. And I want to describe these two complementary rather than opposing journeys. First, the natural philosopher. The natural philosopher begins his journey, his theoretical and aesthetic education, with nature, that is, the object, and moves upward towards mind, or the subject. Remember, we're still using German philosophy. Object is the thing, nature. Subject is the mind, the perceiving mind, the self. So the natural philosopher begins down there, we might say, with the object, with nature, and moves upward to the subject, or mind. His starting point is empirical, a posteriori observations. His method of reasoning is induction, and his goal is general laws and truths. Now that takes a lot of explanation. First of all, he's empirical because he begins with his senses, right? With all the natural things that his five senses perceive. So he begins like a John Locke, let's say, empirically. He's a posteriori because a posteriori in Latin is when you begin with the effects and move your way up to the causes. And that's what we call induction. Inductive reasoning begins with facts and figures and moves its way. A doctor uses inductive reasoning because he takes down all your symptoms, all the facts, and then moves inductively upward to arrive at a diagnosis, right? That's inductive reasoning. That's what a natural philosopher does. Although the philosopher begins down there with the facts, he wants to move up to general laws. Just like the doctor doesn't want to stay with the symptoms, he wants to move up to the diagnosis. The way Coleridge puts it is that the final end of the natural philosopher is to effect the perfect spiritualization of all the laws of nature into laws of intuition and intellect. So again, we begin with empirical observation, but we want to spiritualize it. We want to take it up into the intuitive world, up there. Now, the natural philosopher who does not complete his journey risks falling into the dead end of materialism. In other words, not all natural philosophers make it to the final point. Some of them stop halfway. And if you stop halfway, well, really, you're not a true natural philosopher. So, quote, a pseudo-natural philosopher ends up falling into materialism. Now, when I use the word materialism, I want you to think about it in philosophical terms. Materialism is not consumerism. Philosophically speaking, materialism is the belief that all that exists in the universe is matter and that the spiritual is an illusion. Of course, the perfect example of a materialist would be Karl Marx. He believed that all existed was matter, the physical world. So Marx would stop halfway. He would not spiritualize anything because he doesn't believe there's anything spiritual. All there is the material. So if you don't finish your journey, you're a materialist. Now, as you might guess, Wordsworth is an example of a true natural philosopher, as demonstrated in lyrical ballads, where he transforms the natural into the supernatural, the mundane into the exotic, observation into mystical perception. A natural philosopher sort of transfigures or apotheosizes things, takes them up into a higher realm. And again, what Wordsworth is doing in his portion of lyrical ballads is in keeping with the natural philosopher, natural to supernatural. Well, as you might guess, the transcendental philosopher is the opposite. He begins his journey, his education, with transcendent mind, the subject, and moves downward towards nature, or the object. He doesn't move from natural to supernatural. He moves from supernatural to natural. His starting point, therefore, is intuitive a priori truths. Rather than using empiricism, physical observation, he uses intuition. He thinks, he reasons, he uses logic. He follows a priori truths. Now, these truths are abstract, non-empirical ideals that are logically groundless, but only because they are the ground of everything else. In other words, these truths, some of us call them givens. These are truths that you often can't prove. They're groundless, but they're the ground of everything. The best example of this is God. I mean, I suppose you can't finally prove God, but in many systems of philosophy, if you don't have God as your given, you can't go anywhere. If a posteriori moves from effects to causes, a priori moves from causes down to effects. Now, to begin such a metaphysical journey, the transcendental philosopher must first purge his mind, a la Descartes, of all sensation by assuming what Coleridge calls an absolute scientific skepticism. Some of you are familiar with Descartes' meditations. You'll remember that the way he does that is he sits in his chair and he purges his mind of all physical, empirical things and tries to start afresh. Purge your mind and just begin with mind, with the cogito, right? The I think, therefore I am. You begin there. And then you move yourself down. One of the things I love about Descartes, he actually says that he believes that there are better proofs for the existence of God than for the existence of the world. He's a true transcendental philosopher. He really begins with the subject, with mind, with God, so to speak. Now, from this point, the transcendental philosopher moves downward deductively towards the sensual realities of the physical world. The opposite of induction is deduction. Deduction is when you begin with a general truth or observation and work your way down. Those of you familiar with syllogisms in logic, syllogisms follow deductive reasoning. By the way, deductive and inductive reasoning was invented by Aristotle, that systematic man who gave us the beginning of everything, interestingly enough. Anyway, in other words, if the natural philosopher is seeking a transfiguration, the transcendental philosopher is seeking incarnation. And we've used that word so many times now, an embodying of a spiritual truth. In fact, the ultimate goal of the transcendental philosopher is to incarnate the universal in the concrete. Now, there's a danger. Remember we said natural philosophers who stop halfway become materialists? Well, the transcendental philosopher who does not complete his journey risks falling into the abyss of idealism. Now again, I want to use the philosophical word, idealism, not just somebody that has fancy ideas. Idealism, philosophically speaking, is the belief that the objective material world has no separate existence, no integrity of its own, but is merely a projection of our subjective perceptions. It's very similar to the word solipsism I explained to you several lectures ago, except idealism is a philosophical word, whereas solipsism is a sort of psychological word. If you want a name, the famous German philosopher Fichte, I haven't talked about him, but he's the perfect example of idealism. Again, an idealist, instead of denying the spiritual world, almost basically denies the physical world. The material world is just a projection of the mind. So that's the danger for the transcendental philosopher. Now, as you might guess, Coleridge is an example of a true transcendental philosopher, as demonstrated in his contributions to lyrical ballads. Think about it. The treatment of supernatural events in such a way as to render them natural. Right? If Wordsworth's half of lyrical ballads is natural philosophy, Coleridge's half is transcendental philosophy. It begins with the supernatural and moves to the natural. Finally, whereas the natural philosopher is essentially Aristotelian, the transcendental philosopher is strongly Platonic. And if it's true that every philosopher is either a Platonist or an Aristotelian, and that is true at least until the modern period, then you can say everybody is either a natural philosopher or a transcendental philosopher. It's a very easy way to think about philosophy. Now, you might be guessing this if you're thinking ahead. If both philosophers successfully complete their journeys, guess what? They will meet in the middle, at a metaphysical nexus point of the general and the specific. The journey goes both ways, get two journeys, and they meet in the middle. Isn't that wonderful? Now, indeed, neither journey is complete until there is a fusion of subject and object, mind and nature. They approach them from different ways or different vantage points, but both of them are seeking, finally, a fusion of subject and object, of mind and nature. Now, as a romantic theorist, Coleridge saw the imagination as the faculty most qualified to effect this fusion or marriage of subject and object. The best force, if you will, that can affect this union or marriage is imagination. In fact, Coleridge coined his own word, emplastic, to describe the imagination's power to fuse opposites. Emplastic, he actually made up that word from three Greek words, eis, ein, platein, which means to shape into one. And he put it together, and that's what it means. Emplastic means to shape or to fuse into one. And since the imagination can fuse opposites, then it's most capable of effecting a fusion or marriage of subject and object, mind and nature. Now, whereas 18th century theorists tended to use the words imagination and fancy interchangeably, Coleridge asserted they were distinct powers. Because, again, for Coleridge, imagination becomes so much more important than it does in Kant or Burke that he wanted to be more specific. And so, before Coleridge, people used imagination and fancy as if it were the same word. And sometimes we do that today. But Coleridge really wanted to get at the essence of what imagination is because it was so important to the fusion. And so he made a famous distinction between these two words. He said they're very different. This is his distinction. The fancy is a lesser, limited power that can only shift images around into new patterns. When we're fanciful, we take ideas and shift them around. That's sort of what Kant and Burke meant by imagination. What they meant by imagination, Coleridge says, no, that's only fancy. Imagination is a freer, more vital power. It can recombine ideas and images at will to create new, higher unities. Imagination for Coleridge becomes a higher, almost spiritual power. It's really able to shape and to make things new in a much more radical way than either Burke or Kant would ever say. The imagination makes things that are new. Why? Because only the imagination has a twin ability. It has the ability, first, to perceive or see similitude lurking within similitude lurking within dissimilitude. That's a fancy way of saying similarity lurking within dissimilarity, but Coleridge loves those words. In other words, imagination, if I have an imaginative perceptive power, I can look at different things and see deeper what is similar. I can look at multeity and see unity there. So the imagination first has a perceptual power to see the similarity. Then it has the synthetic power to fuse and reconcile opposites into one. Imagination's no good if it can only see it. It has to not only see the unity, but it has to be able to produce it by unifying or synthesizing all those multiple things into a single thing. So that's why the imagination is central to all romantics. Now, this ideal of the fusion of opposites that is so vital for both the transcendental and natural philosopher, this ideal lies behind most of Coleridge's literary theory. That's why you need to understand transcendental philosopher and natural philosopher and the fusion they're looking for, because that's at the heart of all of Coleridge's theory. In fact, it gives us the key, I believe, to understanding Coleridge's famous distinction between the primary and the secondary imagination. This is one of the most famous things in the Biographia Literaria, but Coleridge devotes one paragraph to it. And so, as so often happens in literary theory, it's up to us to try to explicate and figure out what he means. I'm going to give you my interpretation based on the natural and transcendental philosopher. All right. What is the primary imagination? According to Coleridge, the primary imagination occurs when our own individual subjective consciousness is passively inspired by the absolute self-consciousness of God. He says the primary imagination is an echo in the finite mind of the infinite. This is kind of difficult. Think about God as the ultimate subjective mind. Whenever Coleridge talks about God, he uses God's name from the book of Genesis, or Exodus rather, I am that I am. God is the ultimate self-consciousness, the ultimate subject. And in the primary imagination, that self-consciousness, that infinite self-consciousness of God is echoed in our finite self-consciousness. Now, artists who make use of this creative power, the primary imagination, this echo in the mind, are essentially divine ventriloquists. Poet-prophets who receive direct inspiration from above and respond passively with a song or a poem. In other words, this idea of possession or being a prophet where we're taken over and we are actually a mouthpiece for God or the divine, we're ventriloquized, we're the dummy, so to speak. That is really, I think, what he means by the primary imagination. It's a passive kind of thing because the divine speaks through us. Now, although all romantics yearn for this direct inspiration, they want a direct, unmediated, passive inspiration. We'll see more of that in our next lecture on Shelley. Interestingly, Coleridge actually hails the secondary imagination, rather, as the true source of poetry. Let me explain now what the secondary imagination is. Whereas the primary imagination is passive, the secondary imagination is active. active. Coleridge says its goal is to dissolve, dissipate, and diffuse in order to recreate. In other words, it breaks down in order that it can come back and reunified into a greater whole. That is to say, the secondary imagination takes the raw material given it by inspiration, breaks down that raw material, and then reshapes it into a new and vital form. So we begin with analysis, but we end up with synthesis. That's, I believe, what Coleridge was doing in the Biographia Literaria, taking all that German theory, breaking it down, and then resynthesizing it. And I'm going to show you now that it is precisely the esemplastic power of the secondary imagination that enables poets to create three things: organic wholes, symbols, and concrete universals. And all three of these terminologies are central to Coleridge. And I want to spend the rest of this lecture defining those three things. Now that we understand transcendental philosopher, natural philosopher, the need for synthesis, and how that's linked to the secondary imagination, I'm going to explain these three phenomena. First, the organic whole. Working from the philosophical aesthetic theories of Aristotle, Kant, and Schiller, and many others, Coleridge fashioned an organic theory of poetry. We've heard this word before. Coleridge viewed a poem as an almost living organism in which the whole not only contains each part, but each part contains within itself the whole. Just so, the seed within the apple contains within itself the potential not only for another apple, but for an entire grove of apple trees. In other words, a seed is a part of an apple, but inside the seed is another apple. So the part contains the whole within it. That's true organic theory. Coleridge gives us full-blown organic theory. In fact, Coleridge's definition of what a poem is includes the criterion that it give equal pleasure in the whole as it does in each part. A true poem will give us pleasure in each of the parts, the quotable quotes, as we say, but the entire work as a whole must also give us pleasure, or it's not a true organic whole. In an organic whole, there is a dynamic, incarnational relationship between its form and its content. Again, we've heard this so many times before. Dynamic, incarnational fusion. As though the content of the poem had, like Hegel's idea, created its own form. Remember the image I gave you in my Hegel lecture, lecture number 12, of the liquid that creates its own container? That's what we're talking about here. That kind of dynamic, incarnational relationship where form and content work together symbiotically, to use another phrase. In an organic whole, ideas and images are fused, and dissimilitude is resolved into similitude. It's the ultimate version of romantic synthesis. Now, how do you know if a poem is organic? One way to test if your poem is truly an organic whole is to ask if anything can be added to or taken away from it. If it can, the poet has obviously neither fully realized his purpose nor achieved a complete fusion of parts and whole. If you could take something away from it or add to it without changing it, it's not an organic whole. The same thing again with my body. If you take away a part of my body, I may die. I'm an organic whole. I need everything. I'm made correctly, I hope. Now, Coleridge revolutionized the study of Shakespeare by demonstrating that Shakespeare's plays are not uneven products of an inartistic genius, but organic wholes where each part functions within the whole. Believe it or not, before Coleridge, people read Shakespeare as a wild genius. In other words, they believed that Shakespeare had all these great scenes and soliloquies and whatnot, and they were wonderful, but they believed that Shakespeare's plays as a whole were lumpy. They really didn't work. Coleridge taught us, I think, the proper way of reading Shakespeare. Shakespeare's plays are organic wholes, but you've got to look for the links. And every good college student has written a Coleridgean version of Shakespeare where they, let's say, take a theme in Shakespeare's play and see how that theme is woven throughout the entire organic whole of the play. Coleridge is very important to Shakespeare studies. All right, let's move on to symbols. Unlike many theorists before him, Coleridge privileged symbols over allegories, for he felt symbols came closer to the ideal of the organic whole. What's the difference? In an allegory, an abstract notion is merely translated into a picture language. For instance, in the Middle Ages, if you want an allegory of the inner struggle between good and evil, you would do it by having a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other shoulder. You're all familiar with that picture. That's an allegory. It's a picture language that tries to capture something abstract. Now, why does Coleridge look down on that a little bit? Because he felt that in an allegory, there is no essential link between the idea and the picture. One simply stands in for the other, with the picture merely remaining that. In other words, you could use another picture and it wouldn't make a difference. There's no organic, synthetic relationship between the idea and the picture that's supposed to express the idea. John Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress, is an allegory. A lot of the images he uses could be substituted for something else and it wouldn't make a difference. But in a symbol, Coleridge says, the abstract notion is seen in and through the physical symbol. The best is the Lord's Supper or communion, particularly if you're in a Catholic church, where the wine and bread is believed to be the blood and body of Christ. It's mystical. Now, it doesn't actually become blood. It's still wine, but the wine is blood. That is a symbol where there's a sort of Jacob's ladder between the divine world and the physical world, and there's meaning and ideas running back and forth. Jesus could not have substituted wine for something else. It would be different. Wine and bread is just the right symbol because it's linked to body and blood on a very deep level. In the symbol, what I'm saying, specific and general, temporal and eternal, concrete and universal, meet and fuse in an almost mystical, incarnational way. That's why he privileged symbol over allegory. Finally, let's look at concrete universals. Coleridge, again echoing Aristotle and Kant, uses the phrase concrete universal to denote the highest forms of organic wholes and symbols. To call a poem a concrete universal is to say that within the microcosm of the poem, a universal idea has been fully realized in a concrete form. Think of a movie you saw that fully realized the novel that it was based on. The English Patient would be a good example. When I read that novel, I would never think you can make a movie out of it because it's so literary. But that movie, I believe, fully realized in concrete cinematic form the essence of that novel. I'd encourage you to read the novel and see the movie. I think it's a good example of this realization in concrete form. Let's go back to a Christian allegory. Just as Christ, via the esemplastic power of the incarnation, became both fully man and fully God, so the concrete universal effects a full fusion of an abstract, non-physical idea and a specific physical image. So again, just like Christ is both concrete and universal, both man and God, that's what a concrete universal should be. And by the way, the reason I return to a Christian metaphor here is because Coleridge is really the only Orthodox Christian amongst the major Romantics. Wordsworth seemed to have become Orthodox later in his life, but by then he stopped writing great poetry. So for Coleridge, if you read his Biographia Literaria, he is very Christian in his thinking. In other words, his model for the concrete universal actually is Christ and the idea of the incarnation. So, in other words, Coleridge's aesthetic is also a metaphysic. Everything he says about literature, he believes is the nature of reality and of God. And that's what's so neat and synthetic about him. You go from philosophy to theology to aesthetics, and it's just wonderful. Now, the mystical, reciprocal relationship that forms within such poems, such concrete universals, is timeless. It is as if the concrete image had been carried up into the realm of the idea, even as the idea descends and dwells within the image. In other words, a concrete universal, both are happening at the same time. The universal is coming down and embodying or concretizing itself, and at the same moment, the concrete is moving up and losing itself in the universal. Do you see the link to the beginning of this lecture? Natural philosopher and transcendental philosopher. In the same way that their two journeys meet at that nexus point, that metaphysical union of subject and object, mind and nature, that's what a concrete universal does. It is the full embodiment, we might say, of that dual complementary journey. Again, I find Coleridge's theory just wonderful, and it just goes off in so many directions, and it's so complete. Like I said, it takes in so many areas of thought.